The voice in Joyce Carol Oates' fiction is often dark and dangerous. We hear in its depths something elemental, an urgency never quite decent or tolerable, the expression of a drive to express the inexpressible. We don't always pick up in that voice, not at once, the passion or desperation that informs it. It can sound now and then cool, occasionally even prim, but even there we sense unmistakably the intimation of an overmastering, barely contained chaos or panic. Somewhere, even in precincts apparently tame or decorous, we sense the near presence of something about to flare and take over. As readers of Joyce's work, we are not routinely confident that we know what is about to happen, but we do know enough to feel uneasy, for we know ourselves to be in the hands of a writer who truly has the imagination of disaster. Of course, not everything in Joyce's work is ferocious or menacing. In much of her fiction, there is a wild, manic humor. Even in extremity of feelings, she often locates the absurd, the heightened, even theatrical tendency to performative excess that can make us laugh out loud when confronted by something apparently terrible. Here and there, she builds tension only to set us up for a sly, comic deflation. The spirited telling we have come to savor in all of her fiction can shift shape and direction in entirely unexpected ways. No one would think to describe Joyce Carol Oates as an essentially comic writer, but her gift for comedy is, without question, an important, perhaps even underappreciated aspect of her enormous range. A very long story called Probate came out in the fall 2010 issue of Salmagundi magazine, and I can't help thinking that it displays pretty much everything we admire in Joyce's fiction. But it is also fascinating in seeming to come out of the experience at the heart of Joyce's much-discussed recent memoir, recounting the immediate aftermath of her late husband's death. Of course, we have been trained, as good readers, not to confuse fact and fiction. A resemblance between the situation at the heart of a memoir and the situation central to a story ought not to trigger suppositions about what is and is not, as they say, true to life. And in fact, the trajectory of Joyce's great story, though it deals with a wife's grief, is such as to warn us away from such suppositions, however tempting they may be. But we cannot miss or fail to acknowledge what matters most in that story, so characteristically fervent and unguarded. For here, the menace at issue is progressively unleashed and at large. Which menace? Call it panic bordering on derangement. Call it the movement into negation. Negation, as in the refusal of the moderate and reasonable, as in the negation of the ordinary coping mechanisms and faculties. Thus, we are not surprised, 10 pages or so into this story, that the protagonist should take an elevator in a court building and not be able to trust herself to know which floor she is on. That she should be uncertain about how to take out her wallet to show her ID, or that she should be confused about whether she and other people assembled to fill out certain forms belong among the dead or the living. Nor are we surprised that this woman should be persistently haunted by details from the several days preceding her appearance in probate court, so that she cannot quite arrive at a plausible sense of sequence or continuity to account for her improbable presence in this forbidding place. What Joyce Oates gives us here is an entirely believable portrait of a mind at the end of its tether, an embodied anatomy of a consciousness at risk, in a narrative that lapses in and out of stream of consciousness and proves again and again to be an astonishment and a scourge, which is to say, a rebuke to all of our customary efforts to maintain control, balance. Though Joyce Oates has never gone in for the easy celebration of madness or extremity, she has known in all of her work how to get to the bottom of our fears and our susceptibility to disorder. And she has, again and again, in 1,000 different ways, pointed her finger to the depth of our experience. Joyce Carol Oates.
Thank you very much, Bob. It's wonderful just to come up here in spite of the heat to hear such wonderful things. Bob is the very Mozart of introducers. And last night was so wonderful, too. Wonderful introductions last night. And Chase gave a wonderful reading, and Russell read from his new novel, which is not autobiographical, I think. But we can't draw, as Bob would just say, we can't exactly draw the line. So I thought, since Russell read about a sex offender, which probably alerted and aroused and excited a lot of people in the vicinity, and so they're already coming, that I would continue that tradition and read a story about another kind of sex offender. And I'll be happy to try to answer any questions, except maybe about our sex offender past. Russell and I are not going to go into that, but I'll try to answer any other questions anyone might have about literature. This is a very special occasion for me. I always look forward to it with some anticipation, but some apprehension. It's a wonderful audience, and there are so many brothers and sisters who are equally involved in the derangement of writing, I guess you could call it, the sort of hopeless doom and thrill and excitement of being writers. So I look at people's faces and I sort of feel a real kinship with people here of all ages. But therefore it's really hard to find the right thing to read. And as some people know, I sent emails to them. I said, what should I read? Any suggestions? I have a new novel that will be coming out in the spring, and I looked all through the novel. It just didn't seem to be anything that was appropriate. Some novels are really not written to be read aloud in a situation like this, like in a lecture hall. Some novels really are written to be read introspectively and very quietly. And some short stories can only really be read privately, like some poetry. Let's say poetry of Emily Dickinson, of course it can be read to an audience, but I think most beautifully and most intensely it speaks to the individual. So I couldn't find anything in my whole novel. And my memoir, which Bob mentioned, it's become really too painful for me to read from that, so I just couldn't even think about reading that. But then the sex offender story. I've never read it before. It may be a little long, except if there are people in a certain category in the audience, I'm sure you will want every detail. But I might do a little editing as I go along. I've never read this story before, and I'm not sure if I have the voice for it, because this person is not a sort of innocent like Russell's character, or like Russell. No. I like to think of this as the real thing. It's a real quintessential sex offender. But he wouldn't think of himself that way. He just thinks of himself as just a regular guy. It's called Mark of Satan. Mark of Satan already got some laughs. A woman had come to save his soul, and he wasn't sure he was ready. It is in every afternoon in the dead heat of summer, cicadas screaming out of the trees like lunatics, the sun a soft explosion in the sky, that a husky young woman comes on foot rapping shyly at the screen door of a house not even yours, a house in which you are a begrudged debt, guest to save your soul. And she'd brought an angel child with her, too. Thelma McCord, or was it McCrae, and Magdalena, who was a wisp of a child, perhaps 4 years old. They were Church of the Holy Witness, headquartered Scranton, Pennsylvania. They were God's own and proud, saved souls glowing like neon out of the identical eye sockets. Thelma was an ordained missionary, and this was, quote, her first season of itinerary, and she apologized for disturbing his privacy, but would he, surrender but a few minutes of his time to the teachings of the Holy Witness? He'd been taken totally by surprise. He'd been dreaming, a disagreeable, churning, sinking dream, and suddenly he'd been awakened and summoned by a faint but persistent knocking at the front door. Tugging on wrinkled khaki shorts, yanking up the zipper in angry haste. He was already wearing a T-shirt, frayed and tight in the shoulders. He'd padded barefoot to the screen door, blinking the way a mollusk might blink if it had eyes. There's a metaphor for you. In a house unfamiliar to you, it's like waking to somebody else's dream. And there on the front stoop out of a shimmering hot August afternoon he wanted to sleep through, this girlish, eager young female missionary, an angel of God sent specially deliberately to him. Quickly, before he could change his mind, before intervened, he invited her into the house, and little Magdalena, out of the wicked hot sun, quick. "Thank you," the young woman said, beaming with surprise and gratitude. "Isn't he a kind, thoughtful man, Magdalena?" Mother and daughter were heat days, clearly yearning for some measure of coolness and simple human hospitality. Thelma was carrying a bulky straw purse and tote bag that was heavy with books and pamphlets. The child's face was pinkened with sunburn, and her gaze so downcast she stumbled on the threshold of the door, and her mother murmured "Shh," and clutched her hand tighter, as if already before their visit had begun, Magdalena had brought them both embarrassment. He led them inside and shut the door. The living room opened directly off the front door. The house was a small 3-bedroom track ranch with simulated redwood siding, sparsely furnished, the front room uncarpeted, with twin butterfly chairs in fluorescent lime and a coffee table that was a slab of weather-stained granite set atop cinder blocks. The granite slab was in fact a grave marker, so old and worn by time that its name and dates were unintelligible. His sister Gracie, whose rented house this was, had been given the coffee table slab by a former boyfriend. A stain of the color of tea and the shape of an octopus disfigured a corner of the ceiling, but the missionaries, seated with self-conscious murmurs of thanks on the sofa, would not see it. He needed a name to offer to Thelma McCord or McCrae, who had so freely offered her name to him. "Flash," he said, inspired. "My name is Flashman." He was a man no longer young, yet by no means old, nor even to the eye of a compassionate observer middle age. His ravaged looks, his blood-veined eyes appeared healable. He was a man given, however, to the habit of irony, distasteful to human execution, but virtually impossible to resist. When he spoke to Thelma, he heard a quaver in his voice that was his quick and erratic pulse, but might sound to another's ear like civility. He indicated they should take the sofa, and he lowered himself into the nearest butterfly chair on shaking legs. When the damned contraption nearly overturned, the angel child Magdalena, pale, fluffy blonde hair and delicate features, jammed her thumb into her mouth to keep from giggling, but her eyes were narrowed in alarm. "Mr. Flashman, so pleased to make your acquaintance," Thelma said uncertainly. She smiled at him with worried eyes, possibly contemplating, was he Jewish? Contemplating the likelihood of a Jew, a descendant of God's chosen people, living in the scraggly foothills of southwestern Pennsylvania, in a derelict ranch house 7 miles from Waynesboro, with a front yard that looked as if motorcycles had torn it up. Would a Jew be 3 days unshaven, jaws like sandpaper, knobbly barefoot and hairy-limbed as a gorilla? Would a Jew so readily welcome a holy witness into his house? Offer them drinks, lemonade. But no, he was thinking, no. This an opportunity for him to confront goodness and to look innocence and direct in the eye, as should not be violated. Thelma promised that her visit would not take many minutes of his time. For time, she said breathlessly, is of the utmost. That is one of the reasons I'm here today. Reaching deep into the tote bag to remove, he saw with a sinking heart a hefty black Bible with gilt-edged pages and a stack of pamphlets printed on pulp paper, The Witness, then easing like a brisk mechanical doll into a recitation. The man who called himself Flash was making every effort to listen. He knew this was important. There are no accidents. Hadn't he wakened in the night a pounding heart and a taste of bile with a premonition that something, one of his things, was going to happen soon, whether of his volition and calculation or seemingly by accident? But there are no accidents. He could not know. Leaning forward, gazing at the young woman with an elbow on his bare knee, in the pose of Rodin's thinker, and listening hard, except the woman was a dazzlement of sweaty, fragrant female flesh, speaking passionately of the love of God, passion of Jesus Christ, and the book of Revelation of St. John the Divine, and the testament of the Witness. Then eagerly opening her Bible on her knees and dipping her head toward it, so that her sand-colored, limply curly hair fell into her face, and she had to brush it away repeatedly. He was fascinated by the contrapuntal gestures, the authority of the Bible, and the meek dipping of the head, and the way in which, with childlike unconscious persistence, she pushed her hair out of her face. Unconscious, too, of her grating sing-song voice, an absurd voice, in which no profound truth could ever reside. One of her heavy young breasts straining toward against the filmy material of her lavender print dress, her fattish, muscular calves and good broad feet, and what appeared to be white wicker ballerina slippers. The grimy Venetian blinds of the room were drawn against the glaring heat. It was above 90 degrees outside, and there had been no soaking rains for a week, and in every visible tree hung ghostly bagworm nests. In his sister's bedroom, a single window unit air conditioner vibrated noisily, and it had been in this room, on top of the bed. He'd been sleeping when the knocking came at the front door. The room that was his had no air conditioner. Hurrying out, he left the door to his sister's bedroom open, and now a faint trail of cool metallic air coiled up into the living room. And so he fell to thinking that his visitors would notice the cool air and inquire about it, and he would say, yes, there is air conditioning in this house, in one of the bedrooms. Shall we go into that room and be more comfortable? Now the Bible verses were concluded. Thelma's fair, fine skin glowed with excitement, like a girl who has shared her most intimate secret and now expects you to share yours. Thelma lifted his eyes to Flash's and asked almost boldly, was he aware of the fact that God loves him? And he squirmed, hearing such words, momentarily unable to respond. He laughed, embarrassed, shook his head, and ran his fingers over his sandpaper jaws and mumbled, no, not really. He guessed he was not aware of that. Not really. Thelma said that was why she was here, to bring the good news to him that God loved him, whether he knew of him or acknowledged him, and the Holy Witness was the mediator. Flashman mumbled, is that so? A blush darkened his face. Thelma insisted, yes, it is so. A brimming in her close-set eyes, which were the bluest eyes Flash had ever glimpsed, except in glamour photos of models and naked centerfolds. He said apologetically that he wasn't 100% sure how his credit stood with God these days. God and me, he said with a boyish tucked-in smile, have sort of lost contact over the years. Which was the answer the young female missionary was primed to expect, turning to the little girl and whispering in her ear, and tell Mr. Flashman the good news, Magdalena. And like a wind-up doll, the blonde child began to recite in a breathy, high-pitched voice, we can lose God, but God never loses us. We can despair of God, but God never despairs of us. The Holy Witness records, he that overcometh shall not be hurt by the second death. Abruptly, as she begun, the child ceased, her mouth going slack on the word death. It was an impressive performance, yet there was something chilling about it. Flash grinned and winked at the child, his uneasiness, and said, second death, huh? Oh, what about the first? But Magdalena just gaped at him. Her left eye was losing focus, as if becoming unmoored. The more practiced Thelma quickly intervened. She took up both her child's hands in hers, and in a brisk patty cake rhythm chanted, as the Witness records, God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there will be no more death. Well, maybe. I mean, it was so simple. Maybe there's no more death. Bemused by the simplicity of fate, in this house unknown to him as recently as last week, in this rural no man's land, where his older sister Grace he had wound up a county social worker, toiling long, grueling hours, 5 days a week, and forced to be grateful for the job, he'd heard a rapping like summons to his secret blood, panting barefoot to the door, dreamed o'er that shimmery with light, and there she is. Excuse me, Thelma, would you and Magdalena like some lemonade? Thelma immediately demurred out of country-bred politeness, as he's expected, so he asked Magdalena, who appeared to be parched with thirst, poor exploited child, but annoyingly she was too shy to even shake her head, please, yes. Flash, stimulated by challenge, apologized for not having fresh squeezed lemonade, calculating that Thelma would have to accept to prove she wasn't offended by his offer, adding to which he was about to get some for himself that's icy cold, and would they please join him? So Thelma, lowering her eyes, said yes, and he'd reached out to touch her, and she hadn't dared draw back. In the kitchen, out of sight, he moved swiftly, which was why his name was Flash. For a man distracted, a giant black-feathered eagle tearing out his liver, he moved with surprising alacrity, but that had always been his way. Opening the fridge, nostrils pinching against the stale stink inside, his sister Gracie's depressed housekeeping he tried his best to ignore, taking out the stained Tupperware pitcher of bird's eye lemonade, thank God there was some. Tart chemical taste he'd have to mollify in his own glass with an ounce or two of Gordon's gin. For his missionary visitors, he ducked into his bedroom and located his stash and returned to the kitchen counter, crumbling swiftly between his palms several chalky white pills, 6 milligrams each of barbiturate, enough to fell a healthy horse, reducing them to gritty powder to dissolve into the greenish lemonade he poured into their glasses, the taller for a Thelma, the smaller for a Magdalena. He wondered what the little girl weighed, 40 pounds, 30? He had no idea. Children were mysteries to him. His own childhood was a mystery to him. But he wouldn't want Magdalena's heart to stop beating. He'd seen a full-sized man so glassy-eyed and clutch at his heart and topple over stone dead, overdosing on heroin. It was a clean death so far as deaths go, but it came out of the corner of your eye, and you couldn't prepare. Carefully setting the 3 glasses of lemonade, 2 tall and slim for the adults, the other roly-poly for sweet little Magdalena, on a tray, returning then humming cheerfully to the airless living room where his visitors were sitting primly on the battered sofa, as if in his absence they hadn't moved an inch. Shyly, yet with trembling hands, both reached for the glasses. "Say thank you, sir," Thelma whispered. To Magdalena whispered, "Thank you, sir," and lifted the glass to her lips. Thelma disappointed him by taking only a ladylike sip, then dabbing her at her lips with a tissue. "Delicious," she murmured, but setting the glass down as if it was a temptation. Poor Magdalena was holding her glass in both hands, taking quick swallows, but at a sidelong glance from her mother, she too set her glass down on a tray. Flash said, as if hurt, "There's lots more sugar if it isn't sweet enough." But Thelma insisted no, it was fine, taking up with the look of a woman choosing from several rare gems one of the pulp-printed pamphlets. Now, Flash guessed, she'd be getting down to business, enlisting him to join the Church of the Holy Ghost, or whatever it was, Holy Witness. She named names and cited dates that flew past him, except for the Easter date, 1899, when, apparently, then meant a shower from the heavens north of Scranton, Pennsylvania. And he nodded to encourage her, though she hardly needed encouraging, taking deep, thirsty sips from his lemonade to encourage her, too. Out of politeness, Thelma did lift her glass to take a chaste swallow, but no more. Maybe there was a cult prescription against frozen foods or chemical drinks, the way the Christian scientists, unless it was Seventh-day Adventists, forbade blood transfusion because such was, quote, eating blood, which was outlawed by the Bible. Minutes passed. The faint trickle of metallic, cool air touched the side of his feverish face. He tried not to show his impatience with Thelma, fixing and set on the amazing fact of her, a woman, not known him an hour before, now sitting less than a yard away, addressing him as if, out of the universe, He mattered. Loving how she sat wide-hipped and settled into the vinyl cushions like a partridge in a nest. Knees and ankles together, chunky farm girl feet in the discount mart wicker flats, half-moons of perspiration darkening the underarms of her floral print dress. It was a Sunday school kind of dress, lavender ram with a wide white collar and awkward flared skirt and cloth-covered buttons. Beneath it, the woman would be wearing a full slip, no half slip for her, and damp from her warm, pulsing body, no doubt a white brassiere, D-cups and white cotton panties, the waist and legs of which left red rings in her flesh. She was bare-legged, no stockings, a concession to the heat, just raw female leg, reddish blonde transparent hairs on the calves, for she was not a woman to shave her body hair, nor did she wear makeup, no such vanity. Her cheeks were flushed as if rouge, and her lips were naturally moist and rosy. Her skin would be hot to the touch. She was 28 or 29 years old, and probably Magdalena was not her first child, but her youngest. She had the sort of female body mature by early adolescence, beginning to go flaccid by 35. That fair, thin skin that wears out from too much smiling and aiming to please. Suggestion of a double chin. Hips would be spongy and cellulite puckered. Kneaded like white bread, squeezed, banged, and bruised. Another woman would have been aware of Flash's calculating eyes on her like ants swarming over sugar, but not this impassioned missionary for the Church of the Holy Witness. Had an adder risen, quivering with desire before her, she would have taken no heed. She was reading from one of the witness pamphlets. Her gaze was shining and inward. She evoked in a little girl voice a vision of bearded prophets raving in the deserts of Smyrna and covenants made by Jesus Christ to generations of sinners up to this very hour. Jesus Christ was the most spectacular of the prophets, it seemed, for out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword, casting terror into all who beheld. Yet he was a poet. His words had undeniable power. He was Flash the man squirming in his butterfly chair, as Thelma recited tremulously, "And Jesus spake, I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and have the keys of hell and death." There was a pause. A short distance away, a neighbor was running a chainsaw, and out on the highway, traffic passed in an erratic, swooshing stream, and on all sides beyond the house's wall, the air buzzed and quivered and vibrated and rang with insects of late summer. But otherwise it was quiet, like a vacuum waiting to be filled. The child Magdalena, unobserved by her mother, had drained her glass of lemonade, licked her lips with a flinking pink tongue, and was beginning to be drowsy. She wore a pink rayon dress like a nightie, tiny feet in white socks and shiny plastic shoes. Flash saw, yes, the child's left eye had a cast in it. The right eye perceived you head-on, but the left drifted outward like a shy, wayward moon. A defect in the eye of so beautiful a child would not dampen Flash's ardor. He was certain of that. 10 minutes, 15. By now it was apparent that Thelma did not intend to drink her lemonade, though Flash had drained his own glass and wiped his mouth. Did she suspect? Did she sense something wrong? But she'd taken no notice of Magdalena, who had drifted off into a light doze, her angel head drooping, and a thread of saliva shining on her chin. Surely a suspicious Christian mother would not have allowed her little girl to drink spiked lemonade, handed to her by a barefoot, bare-legged pervert, possibly a Jew, with eyes like the yanked-up roots of thistles. That was encouraging. "Your lemonade, Thelma," Flash said with a host's frown. "It will be getting warm if you don't." Thelma seemed not to hear. She was asking, "Have you been baptized, Mr. Flashman?" For a moment he could not think who Flashman was. The gin coursing through his veins, which ordinarily buoyed him up like debris riding the crest of a flood, and provided him with an acute clarity of mind, had had a dulling, downward sort of effect. He was frightened of the possibility of one of his things veering out of his control, for in the past, when this has happened, the consequences were always very bad. For him, as for others. His face burned. "I'm afraid that's my private business, Thelma. I don't bare my heart to any stranger who walks in off the road." Thelma blinked startled. "Oh, I know I've overstepped myself. Please forgive me, Mr. Flashman." Such passion quickened the air between them. Flash felt a stab of excitement, ducking his head, boyish, repentant, and murmuring, "No, it's okay. I'm just embarrassed, I guess. I don't truly know if I was baptized. I was an orphan discarded at birth and set out with the trash. There's a multitude of us scorned by the man and God. What happened to me before the age of 12 is lost to me, just a whirlwind of oblivion." He should have left his sister's bedroom door shut, though, to keep the room cool. If he had to carry or drag this woman any distance, the child wouldn't be much trouble. He'd be miserable by the time he got to where he wanted to go. Thelma all but exploded with solicitude, leaning forward as if about to gather him up in her arms. "Oh, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard, Mr. Flashman. I wish one of our elders was here right now to counsel you, as I cannot. Set out with the trash? Can it be? Can any human mother have been so cruel?" "If it was a cruel mother, which I don't contest, it was a cruel God guiding her hand, Thelma, wasn't it?" Thelma blinked rapidly. This was a proposition not entirely new to her, but one which required a moment's careful and conscious recollection. She said uncertainly with first, then with gathering momentum, "The wickedness of the world is Satan's hand, and the ways of Satan, as of the ways of God, are not to be comprehended by man." "What's Satan got to do with this? I thought we were talking about the good guys." "Our Savior, Jesus Christ." "Our Savior? Who says? On my trash heap I looked up and he looked down and he said, 'Screw you, kid, life is unfair.'" Oh, Thelma's expression was one of absolute astonishment. "Like a cow," Flash thought ungallantly, in the instant before the sledgehammer comes crashing down on her head. Flash added, quick to make amends, "I thought this was about me, Thelma, about my soul. I thought the Holy Witness or whoever had something special to say to me." Thelma was sitting stiff, her hands clasping her knees. One of the pamphlets had fallen to the floor. Her eyes now were alert and wary. She knew herself in the presence of an enemy, yet did not know that more than theology was at stake. "The Holy Witness does have something special to say to you, Mr. Flashman, which is why I'm here. There's a growing pestilence in the land, flooding the Midwest with the waters of the wrathful Mississippi. Last year, raising the Sodom and Gomorrah of Florida. Everywhere there are droughts and famines and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, all signs that the old world is nearing its end. As the witness proclaimed in the book of Revelation, that is our sacred scripture, quote, 'There will be a new heaven and a new earth as the first heaven and the first earth pass away. And the Father on his throne declaring, Behold, I make all things new.'" Flash interrupted, "None of this is new. It's been around for how many millennia, Thelma, and what good's it done anybody?" "I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end," Thelma continued, unheeding, riding from the sofa like a fleshy angel of wrath in her lavender dress, fumbling to gather up her Bible, her pamphlets, and her dazed child. "I will give unto him that is athirst of the fountain of life freely, but the fearful and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and all liars shall sink into the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." Her voice rose jubilantly on the word death. Flash struggled to disentangle himself from the butterfly chair. The gin had done something weird to his legs. They were numb and rubbery. Cursing, he fell to the floor, the rock-hard, carpetless floor. As Thelma aroused Magdalena and lifted her to her feet and half-carried her to the door. Flash tried to raise himself by gripping the granite marker coffee table, but this too collapsed. The cinder blocks gave way, and a heavy slab came crashing down on his right hand. 3 fingers were broken at once, but in the excitement, he seemed not to notice. "Wait, you can't leave me, I need you." At the door, Thelma called back, panting, "Help is needed here. There is Satan in this house." Flash stumbled to his feet, following the woman to the door, calling after, "What do you mean, Satan in this house? There is no Satan, there is no devil. It's all in the heads of people like you religious maniacs. You're mad, wait." He could not believe the woman was escaping so easily, that his thing was nothing of his at all. Hauling purse, bulky tote bag, sleep-dazed daughter on her hip, Thelma was striding in her ballerina flats swiftly, yet without apparent haste or panic, out to the gravel driveway. There was a terrible quivering of the sun-struck air. Cicadas screamed like fire sirens. Flash tried to follow after, propelling himself on his rubbery legs, which were remote from his head, which was too small for his body, and at the end of a swaying stalk. He was laughing and crying, "You're a joke, people like you. You're tragic victims of ignorance and superstition. You don't belong in the 20th century with the rest of us. You're the losers of the world. You can't cope. You need salvation." Staring amazed at the rapidly departing young woman, the dignity in her body, the high-held head and the very arch of her backbone, her indignation that was not fear, an indignation possibly too primitive to concede to fear, like nothing in his experience, nor even in his imagination. If this was a movie, he was thinking, panicked, the missionary would be walking out of the frame, leaving him behind, just him. "Help, wait, don't leave me alone." He was screaming, terrified. He perceived that his life was of no more substance than a cicada's shriek. He stumbled as far as the driveway when a blinding light struck him, like a sword piercing his eye and brain. Fallen to his knees then in the driveway amid sharp gravel and broken glass, and bawling like a child beyond all pride and shame. His head was bowed and sun beating down on the balding crown of his head. His very soul wept through his eyes, for he knew he would die, and nothing would save him, not even irony. No, not even his wickedness would save him. Yet, seeing him stricken, the young Christian woman could not walk away. He cried, "Satan is here in me. He speaks through me. It isn't me. Please help me. Don't leave me to die." His limbs shook as if palsied, and his teeth chattered despite the heat. Where the young woman stood waving, there was a blurry, shimmering figure of light, and he pleaded with her and tore open his chest and belly to expose the tumor of Satan choking his entrails. He begged for mercy, for help, for God's love, until at last the young woman cautiously approached him to a distance of about 3 feet, kneeling too, though not in the gravel driveway, but sensibly in the grass, and by degrees putting aside her distrust, seeing the sickness in the sinner howling to be saved, she bowed her head and clasped her hands to her breast and began to pray loudly, triumphantly, "O Heavenly Father, help this tormented sinner to repent of his sins and to be saved by your only begotten Son, that he might stand by the throne of your righteousness." How many minutes the missionary prayed over the man who had in jest called himself Flashman, he would not afterward know, for there seemed to be a fissure in time itself. The two were locked in ecstasy as if in the most intimate of embraces in the fierce heat of the sun, and in the impulsive generosity of her spirit, the young woman reached out to clasp his trembling hands in hers and squeeze them, admonishing him, pray to Jesus Christ every hour of every day, pray to him in your heart. She was weeping too, and her face was flushed and swollen. He pleaded with her not to leave him, for Satan was still with him. He feared Satan's grip in his soul. But there was a car at the end of the driveway toward which the child Magdalena had made her unsteady way, and now a man's voice called, "Thelma, Thelma," and at once the young woman rose to her full height, brushing her damp hair out of her face, and with a final admonition to him to love God and Christ and abhor Satan, she was gone and vanished into the light out of which she had come. Alone he remained kneeling, too weak to stand, rocking and swaying in the sun. His parched lips moved, uttering babble. In the frenzy of self-abnegation he ground his bare knees into the gravel and shattered glass deeper and deeper into the pane, so that he might bleed more freely, bleeding all impurity from him, or at least mutilating his flesh so that in the arid stretch of years before him, that would constitute the remainder of his life, he would possess a living memory of this hour, scars he might read like Braille. When Gracie Shuttle returned home hours later, she found her brother Harvey in the bathroom, dabbing at his wounded knees with a blood-soaked towel, picking bits of gravel and glass out of his flesh with the tweezers. And his hand. Several fingers of his right hand were swollen as sausages and grotesquely bruised. Gracie was a tall, lank, sardonic woman of 41, with deep-socketed eyes that rarely acknowledged surprise. Yet, seeing Harvey in this remarkable posture, sitting on the toilet seat, a sink of blood-tinged water beside him, she let out a long, high whistle. "What the hell happened to you?" she asked. Harvey raised his eyes to his. He did not appear to be drunk or drugged. His eyes were terribly bloodshot, as if he'd had one of his crying jags, but his manner was unnervingly composed. His face was ravaged and sunburned and of even splotches as if it had been baked. He said, "I've been on my knees to the Gethsemane and back. It's too private to speak of." From years ago, when by an accident of birth they'd shared a household with two hapless adults who were their parents, Gracie knew that her younger brother in such a state was probably telling the truth, or a kind of truth. She knew also that he would never reveal it to her. She waved in his face a pulp religious pamphlet she found on the living room floor beside the collapsed granite marker. "And what the hell is this?" she demanded. But again, that look of maddening calm. Harvey said, "It's my private business, Gracie. Please shut the door on your way out." Gracie slammed the door in Harvey's face and charged through the house to the rear, where a wild bamboo was choking the yard. Since she moved in 3 years before, the damn bamboo had spread everywhere, marching from the marshy part of the property where the cesspool was located, too close to the surface of the soil. Just her luck. And with her master's degree in social work from the University of Pennsylvania, she'd expected more from her education and from life. She lit a cigarette and rapidly smoked it, exhaling luxurious stream of smoke through her nostrils. "Well, screw you," she said, laughing. She frequently laughed when she was angry, and she laughed a good deal these days. It was funny. Whatever it was funny. Her parolee, kid brother, once an honors student, now a balding, middle-aged man picking tenderly at his knees that looked as if somebody had slashed them with a razor. That blasted, sober look in the poor guy's eyes, she hadn't seen in him in 12 years, since one of his junkie buddies in Philadelphia had dropped over dead, mainlining heroin. Some of the bamboo stalks were brown and desiccated, but most of the goddamn stuff was still greenly erect, 7 feet tall and healthy. Gracie flicked her cigarette butt out into it, waiting bored to see if it caught fire. If there'd be a little excitement out here on Route 71 tonight, the Waynesboro volunteer firemen exercising their shiny red equipment, and every yokel 4 miles hopping in his pickup to come gape. But it didn't, and there wasn't. Thank you. Well, okay. Thank you very much. So I'll be happy to answer questions for a few minutes, if you have any. I've never read that story before, and I had to censor part of it, and I wasn't sure how it was going to end. No, I had a sense. This person, I really felt how desperate he was, and suddenly he's really serious. You know, he really feels that he does want to be saved. And first he thinks that Satan is a joke, but then he sort of feels that there is something in him that's very sick, and that maybe somebody could help him. And I think we sometimes feel that, you know, first these things start off as symbolic, and they're in other people's imaginations, and we think that they're just sort of ridiculous, you know. And then at some point, maybe we feel the desperation of absolute isolation and this extremity, and that maybe this person could help him. Yes?
I thought we were headed in a Flannery O'Connor direction and veered off wonderfully at the end, you know. Especially with the word stride, and you know she's safe.
Yes, you know. Yes, that's true. Yes. Pat?
Have you ever gotten well into a work of fiction and felt uncertain about whether it was going to be a story or a novella, and discovered that it was going to be something else, something much longer?
Well, several times when I've been here, I read from a manuscript, and I would have liked to have done that tonight. But once I read The Zombie, my story called Zombie, which was quite short, I mean, 15 pages, and I read it here, and then later on, it became a novella. So it was actually finished, I thought, but then somehow the act of reading it and seeing it published and thinking about it, sometimes you see something that's been published in a magazine, and you read it as a reader, and feel that maybe it wasn't finished. So that's happened a few times. That's really very nice, because the first draft of something is always difficult. I find writing a mystery. The act of writing is maybe more mysterious as you've done more and more of it, because you feel you should know it better. But it's still, I mean, all my writer friends and brothers and sisters who are writers, I think we probably all feel that. And that it gets harder too, because we've done certain things, so we want to do something different.
There must be
Yes, sir.
numerous characters in your work sort of calling for more. How do you decide which one to write on?
Well, I have so many more ideas in my files. I have many ideas. I won't live long enough to execute them. The execution of the idea is a difficult thing, and the characters themselves seem very fully formed, and I really have a sense of them. And I have a sense of plots, lots of plots. In fact, I'll give away some of these if you want them. You can. I've a lot of things. I look in the files and I see character studies of people and some of their remarks, and they're just so real to me. And then maybe this is something I wrote 3 years ago or 13 years ago, and I've lost that spark, that little bit of enthusiasm, that without which you can't really write without that feeling of kind of thrilling excitement. I teach at Princeton University, and sometimes I ask a student. It says sometimes a story doesn't seem to have any evident life to it. You know, it's like it's been a duty for the student. And I ask him, why did you write this? What excited you about this? What was thrilling? What made the hairs stand up on the back of your neck? And then they may say something that's not even in the story. So we have to sort of go back and try to find that enthusiasm. And sometimes if you're writing a novel, it can be on page 500, but there has to be something that is the initial impetus. And then writing the novel, it's like all these different tributaries come together into the stream. The novel is a thick stream like the Hudson River, and there are all these different tributaries, but you really need all these different things flowing into it. Yes, sir?
I'd like to ask you a question about a widow story, which I find the most powerful and wrenching spousal loss memoir that I've read. In it, you mention 3 women who also lost their husbands and then wrote about it in memoirs or a novel, Gal Godwin, Sandra Gilbert, and Joan Didion. While you were writing that book, did you read other memoirs written by women or men who lost their spouses? And if so, did you find that reading helpful?
Oh, well, it's a complicated question, because when a widow's story was not written in the way that most books are written. It was taken from journal entries. And so the journal entries are in the historical present, and everything is kind of just happening right now. So there are paragraphs or little chapters this long that really happened right then, and the person who wrote this down didn't know it was going to happen the next day. So that's a different kind of writing from the historical past, where you said, like, once upon a time all this happened, but it's really in the past that I'm recounting the story. And so it was not really written in the way I would write a novel. So I didn't feel that I had that mastery over it. I felt that I was borne along in some sort of dark water, and I didn't really know where it was going, but I thought there was some solace in writing it. The other memoirs that I read, some of them I read afterward, and some I read Joan Didion's quite a few years ago. I had read it in manuscript or bound galley. I mean, I read it before it was published. Those are all stories about things that happened in the past for them. I don't think I've looked at them since then, but Joan can only write. I mean, I know Joan a little bit, and we all write the only way we can. Joan can only write in a way that's cool and ironic and somewhat distant. She wouldn't be able to write like, Sylvia Plath talks about the blood jet is poetry. Like that's a pretty horrific image, and it costs people a lot to write that way, as it costs Sylvia Plath a great deal. I mean, the idea of the blood jet being poetry, it's very different from the kind of writing that we get, from Proust. Proust is writing in a very elegant and very controlled way. And all these ways are different ways of writing, so I'm not sure that one can really help one another. You have your own way of writing. I would definitely recommend a person keeping a diary or a journal. When you embark upon a traumatic time in your life, and you can't not avoid these times, they happen to everybody. Some people just don't want to think about it at all, and they're not prepared, and they don't want to think about it afterward, and they don't. I think it was Philip Roth in Patrimony talked about his father when the mother died. Philip went to their apartment, and the father had given away all the mother's clothing, overnight or something. And it was a stunning thing to do, because it's such an act of, I think, of desperation to get rid of all the deceased person's things right away like that. Other people hang on to them like forever and have a shrine. There are all these different ways of dealing with what's unspeakable, and each person has his own way. But some ways seem to me sort of a mistake or desperate. Do anything too desperately and throw things away that are irrevocable. But taking notes and just writing late at night if you can't sleep, the writing in itself is a kind of solace. And when I was in that state, I found many things I would have thought would be a solace to me didn't really help me at all. I thought, well, I can always read, and I can try to work on my novel or do something like that. Anything that required concentration, I couldn't do. I thought, well, I'll read this new translation of the Brothers Karamazov, I've got 3 pages. And I remember how tired I was, and I thought, this is so pathetic. I'm reading this novel that I originally read as an undergraduate when I was young and excited, and now I've lost my husband, and I'm pretending that this book can do anything for me. It's so pathetic. Everything seemed freighted and weighted with this air of pathos and the ridiculous. So you're kind of ending up doing things that you can do. And one of the crazy things I did, which is in my memoir, I put lots of embarrassing things in the memoir because I noticed the memoirs I did read are pretty elevated, and my memoir is not elevated. It has a lot of really embarrassing and sort of ridiculous things in it. But one of the things I was doing late at night was looking at television. And there's like Sargasso Sea of horrific things you don't know are on at 4 a.m. I swear, unless it was a hallucination, I saw What's My Line? Like from 1954? Jack Parr, Dorothy Kilgarn, Bennett Cerf. They were in my bedroom. And I'm sitting there, and I'm lying in my bed, which is all a turmoil. I thought, what am I doing? And if my husband, Ray, I thought, if he saw this, if he's looking in the window or something, he'd say, Joyce, what in God's name are you doing? I've been gone like a day, and you're completely crazy. And so I just sort of flipping through the channels. I never watched anything more than 4 minutes. And then it was the X-Files. Remember those? The X-Files, the most ludicrous things were on this television. Well, this was supposed to be a serious program. I remember it was very popular. Just ludicrous things. Like a man who would kiss women and then they would become all rotten. They would sort of putrescence or something. And I thought, well, that's not very, very subtle symbolism. Then about 5 in the morning, I would finally fall asleep. But then at about 7 in the morning, my dear friend, I won't say her name, some friend would come over and rap on my door to make sure I was still alive. And I would sort of hide in the bed. And she'd say, Joyce, knock on the door, And so it just went on one day after another. So all those things I put in my memoir. But it's just too painful for me to read parts of it. But this part I can talk about. Maybe one more question. Oh, yes.
What is the most common mistake that you've observed in the work of student writers or even your fellow writers?
Oh, the most common mistake I've observed in the writing of my fellow writers. I'll begin right. Shall I begin? I can do the poets too. I read the poets. There's people way in the back will not be spared. I see them way back there, cringing. Well, let's see. Well, maybe I'll save that for a little later and just tell them personally. The most common mistake? Well, it's easier to find things that they do right, I think. Easier to find things that they do right. I mean, not that many of the things that they do so many things wrong. That was actually a joke. You know, well, say sometimes they have my students at Princeton, I think the most valuable thing about them is a kind of ardor and energy and naivete and enthusiasm, that they will write about things that have been done many, many times, but they haven't read that much, so they don't know that this has been done before. You know, I'm waiting for somebody to come in with a novel about a white whale. You know, but they will take off a whole summer to work on something that, in a sense, has been done before, but not by them. You know, it's a whole new thing, and they may bring something new to it. For instance, I'll give you one example, just one example. Jonathan Safran Foer was my student some years ago, actually not that long ago. Jonathan Foer wrote a senior thesis that was called Everything is Illuminated. Now, Jonathan really wanted, between his junior and senior years, he was my student, to write a senior thesis, which is almost like a master's thesis. It can be as much as 200 pages. And it's only undergraduate work, but they all work very hard. He wanted to write a historical memoirist piece. He's going back to Ukraine, to the village where his grandfather had fled. His grandfather had been helped by a Catholic woman or girl. I guess it was a girl. And helped to escape, and so he was saved. And so sometime later, Jonathan was born. It was sort of his miracle story. So Jonathan went to Ukraine. Now, many people have gone. Many young Jews have written about the Holocaust, and they've written about going back and so forth. But for Jonathan, it was like the first time. He'd never done this before, and he wasn't even particularly Jewish. He isn't religious. The whole Jewish thing was just something that almost happened because it was his family. So he went to Ukraine, and when he got there, it was like an old field. There was maybe some rubble. There was no village there. There was nobody to talk to. He was going to interview people. There was nobody there. The Nazis had killed everybody, and the ones that the Nazis hadn't killed, the Ukrainians had killed. So all the Jews were gone. So he went back to a hotel or a bed and breakfast, and he thought, well, I either hang myself or I have to make it all up. And that was it. So he was desperate to write the senior thesis, so he made it all up. And he put himself in the novel. There is a character named Jonathan who's sort of hapless and funny, and lots of things go wrong. He's a vegetarian. In Eastern Europe, people only eat meat, and they eat raw meat. they eat Jews. I mean, the whole idea is... And they looked at Jonathan Foer as a vegetarian, and they couldn't understand what this American boy, he didn't eat meat, so he'd have to order a big slab of meat with 2 little potatoes on the plate, and then he would eat the potatoes. And one scene, one of the potatoes falls on the floor, and he's eating the dirty potato. And all this, I thought, was so wonderful because Jonathan embarked upon his voyage of wonderful discovery because he didn't know that it had been done before. Because, in fact, though it had been done many, many times before, it had never been done by Jonathan before. So I think that's sort of the secret of the writing of young people, that they may have all these mistakes and are doing things wrong and so forth. But the one thing about them is that they have their own story, and that they'll make their way through this thicket of a jungle. They'll make their way stumbling and gasping, but it's going to be their own way. Thank you.